talk about how the events of Revelations could be accomplished by modern technology. I'll give you a few examples. So, one of the trumpet judgments is where a mountain of fire erupts. It scorches a third of the earth, then the sky is darkened, and the light is reduced by a third. And then what happens after that is you have something called wormwood that poisons a third of the water, turns to blood, and prevents heat from happening. So I want to give you my theory. My theory is this. So imagine that you have a nuclear war. What happens? Well, they say that over 1,000 nuclear weapons would knock dust into the atmosphere and prevent light from coming through and cause an ice age. So let's first talk about the nuclear firebombing. Like if you had nuclear weapons go off in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, effect that happened was everything lit on fire instantly. And the firestorm that happened caused all the burning. Like it was just a gigantic blaze, and I guess when you have so many independent fires next to each other, they become a massive fire and they will go significantly higher. Like I saw this example where they lit alcohol glasses on fire, and there's a documentary on this. I can't remember it, but it's on YouTube. It's free, and it had basically they lit these shot glasses on fire, and when they lit all of them and they blew a fan over it, like it was not just the height of the shot glasses. So the shot glasses might have been like this tall, right? Like the height of my thumb. But then the actual fire was like this tall. And the reason why is it created a bit of like a fire tornado, and it was probably 20, 30 times the height of the shot glasses. And supposedly this is what happens during forest fires as well. And it's what happened during the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Oh, I'm balding. Look at that. So yeah, so the gist of that is you could have a mountain of fire from just a couple nuclear weapons. So a third of the world being destroyed in nuclear fire is extremely likely if there were a nuclear holocaust. Like for instance, a thermonuclear weapon has a range of, in many cases, 100 plus kilometers of just pure fire. Like, and there are a huge number of those. That technology's been around since the 60s. And these things can go, like, I'll give you an example. The Tsar Bomba in the 1960s was put up in the Arctic in Svalbard, and people 200 miles away had broken windows, or 200 kilometers away had broken windows. And the shockwave went around the world 8 times, and they only used half of the payload that the thing was designed for. Even the plane flying it had a 50% chance of survival. So when you take that all into account, here's what you get. So you could have a fire easily being caused by that. And I've watched TED Talks on this. The most significant event in a nuclear war is not the actual nuclear fire itself, it's that the atmosphere would have dirt knocked into it. So when a supervolcano erupts, and there's been several extinction events in our history where you either had a meteor come down and hit the earth, or a supervolcano erupt, which is a very large volcano that knocks like huge amounts of ash into the atmosphere. And so the significance of this, when a supervolcano erupts, or that happens, you have all this ash up in the atmosphere and it blocks the sunlight. Sunlight typically warms the planet, and it doesn't take much of that to put the Earth into an ice age. It's happened many, many times. And so this is actually what happened in the Dark Ages. The 700 BC, you had, or 700 AD, you had stuff get knocked into the air from, I think, I forget what eruption it was. And in the 1800s, they had a couple of years without a summer. That was due to the Krakatoa volcanic eruption, which is an island basically north of Australia. I can't remember the name of it for the life of me, but yeah. So the long story short is that nuclear weapons, the main risk of them, just 1,000 normal nuclear weapons going off would cause an ice age due to the dust they knock in the atmosphere. And finally, nuclear radiation is where particles that are touched by the nuclear stuff are irradiated, and they rain down after. So if you've ever seen a nuclear blast, it will have what's called black rain, which is where the soil is rained back down to the earth nearby. And there's simulators you can see where the nuclear radiation would fall. But wormwood is described where a third of the earth would be hit with radiation. So to recap this, the Bible describes like a third of the earth being burnt in a giant mountain of fire, which sounds very much like a nuclear explosion and the resulting firestorm. Then They talk about a third of the sky being blotted out, which very well could describe like a layer of dust being in the atmosphere and it decreasing the amount of sunlight and decreasing the temperature. Then they talk about a third of the oceans and the waters being poisoned, which very much could be radiation poisoning falling upon it. So you imagine like one region gets nuked. Let's say it's either the North American region, or let's say it's like another area like Europe or like Asia, or even parts of each. You would have a maybe a third of the world burning. It's extremely easy. Like a third of the world would be a moderate example of what could be done. And having the dust in the atmosphere would in fact lessen the amount of sunlight, so it would appear to be night during the day even. And then to top it off, having the radiation fall down into the water sources very much could cause a mass death of fish and all other animals. So the technology to make that mountain of fire thing happen already exists, and it's existed since the 60s. And there are what the United States, the USSR, China, and even India and Pakistan all have the ability to end the world in that way. And as the number of people who have that ability increases, we have an increased likelihood of it happening. So that's just from that mountain of fire thing. Another interesting one too is they describe these like almost drone-like creatures flying around and tormenting the non-believers. Now, I want you to picture that. You've seen drones, and you know that, and I'm assuming you've read articles too, where you've known that even for a while we've had drones that are the size of a fly that are meant to spy on people. Now, it is not like the way to describe the zone drones. To describe it having like the galloping of horses, and most people think that this could be like a helicopter, like sound like a boop 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 boop, like a repeated, almost like a very light galloping sound or a helicopter sound. So in that one, for instance, you have these drones supposedly flying around, and they're golden in one part, and they have a stinger, and they can torment people, but they won't cause them to die. So it almost sounds like you have some sort of chemical warfare attached to small drones, because right now, like I'll give you an example, that China has AI based drones that fly around and they can be deployed from like a drone mothership and has all these other mini drones on it. And the US has had that for a long time, at least from what I've heard. Um, so the little animals coming and attacking non-believers but not killing them with like a scorpion like tail and making it sound similar to a helicopter, that has that's existed for maybe what 10 years. So the technology behind that also exists. Now there's another interesting thing too. In the Bible, there's described as a global earthquake. Now we know that in the west coast of the United States, there's one called the Big One, and there's a prediction that there are two earthquakes that could potentially happen at the same time. There is the Great Earthquake that leveled San Francisco about 100 years ago that happens once every 100 years. It takes place in Southern California. But there's another thing called the Cascadia earthquake, and it's off the coast of Oregon that is supposed to be happening every 400 years. It's one of the worst ones, and it's believed that both earthquakes will happen at the same time. I was watching a documentary on this too, and I guess there is some plate that is getting pushed under. I don't have another hand to describe this, but basically, like, imagine my fist is the first plate. So apparently, there's this plate. There's another plate down here that like used to be attached that broke off, and then there's another plate. Let me try to prop my phone up some way where I can like display this. But apparently, there's like another plate here. Like there's the Pacific plate. There's the like the Pacific plate, like the Asia Pacific, then the United States plate. And this one's going like under here or something, right? So, but you also had this point that broke off, and this is getting pushed over toward Yellowstone. Now, Yellowstone National Park is known as the world's largest supervolcano, and it's believed that it could erupt at some point too. But the caldera is half empty, so they think we have longer, but it's been a long time since it's erupted. Now, there's a theory that this broken off plate is beneath Yellowstone, and that when the big earthquakes happen, it's going to push the plate that's like this little broken off piece that presumably has been blocking the magna flow to Yellowstone out of the way. So if you can imagine this, there's a gigantic like 10 on the Richter scale earthquake that happens between Japan and California, and the north, little more northern. Like think of like Manchuria like Japan, like northern Japan, southern Russia, that kind of deal, in California. Now this one's supposed to be a huge, gigantic thing called the Big One. There's another one that is basically in California, and then obviously you have the supervolcano thing. So between those three, you would have earthquakes like the world has never seen before, a potential extinction level event. Now this is supposed to kill, I forget how many people, like third again. Yeah, I don't remember. But we have the physical processes to know that this could happen again. Now, another interesting one, too, is the rapture of the Christians. They say that the Christians will meet Jesus in the air, and they describe just crumpled clothing. So we don't have, I mean, that one is a little harder to predict. Like, I could predict anything from, like, concentration camps or something. Maybe, like, Christians will have to almost take some sort of action. Like, it'll be some sort of, like, maybe like Holocaust event, and Christians will be sheltering people or something. Like maybe there'll be something like that that causes it. I can't. That one's a little harder to guess. Like it's, I don't have a working theory for it for the most part, unless it's like a concentration camp thing. But what about like people who are like in a like coma, like laying sick in bed and can't do anything to help anyone? Like I don't know how they would be raptured as well if that were the case. So that one's a little bit weak of a theory, but the global earthquake very much could be the big one in California, and combined with the Cascadia and the supervolcano eruption. The mountain of fire very easily could be a nuclear attack. And finally, the animals flying around tormenting people, that very much could be, you know, that very much could be drones. So the technology for a lot of these already exists. So I don't think the time of revelation is that far off, if that makes any sense. So yeah, it's an interesting set of theories, but we'll see if I'm right or not. Like, I mean, it seems like we're increasingly heading toward the end of the world, because obviously World War III is, you know, like the sickness and whatnot. Like we have bioweapons, and Russia and China have bioweapons that could also cause that. Like a third of the world going into sickness and dying off. That's entirely like what is it? The fourth horseman of the apocalypse. Like, conquest leading to war and lack of peace, leading to just greed and lack of supplies, and then leading to death. I mean, that sounds a lot like the conflict we're seeing now, where we're basically fighting Russia in a proxy war, Russia-Chinese alliance in a proxy war over Ukraine, and they're building bases all over the place, and we're just running short of supplies. This sounds like a lot like what we're going through now. If this is in fact the case, then at some point the Christians will meet Christ in the air, and obviously it's hard to anticipate what kind of form that would take. They say no one can predict it. It will happen like a thief in the night. But if I were in your shoes, I would make sure you are always praying each night and going to church, because I don't think we have long left. And the technology to create the events described in the rapture already exists. And that's kind of terrifying if you think about it. Like, almost all of the events that happen in Revelations could be explained scientifically, given current weaponry and given, current, geothermal and geovolcanic events. Like, if that isn't, like, a sign of what's to come, I don't know what is. So, yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking about that for a while, and I wanted to put that out there somewhere, and I thought this would be kind of cool to make a video of. So, let me know what you think.